September 1939. Europe teetered on the brink of catastrophe. In Berlin, the streets were alive with flags and fervent rallies. Every citizen caught up in the hypnotic rhetoric of a nation convinced of its destiny. Lieutenant Klaus Weber walked past the Reichstag, his uniform crisp, polished boots echoing on the cobblestones. He had been raised to follow orders, to believe in loyalty above all else. Yet, as he watched men chant and wave swastikas under the gray sky, a shadow of doubt began to creep into his mind. The speeches spoke of glory, of a future where Germany would dominate Europe, but Klaus could not ignore the faces in the crowds. Hopeful yet anxious, eager yet fearful. Thousands of miles away in Warsaw, Poland's capital, life seemed normal on the surface. The sun glinted off the rooftops, children played in the streets, and shopkeepers arranged their wares in bustling markets. But behind the cheerful facade, there was unease. Rumors of German mobilization had reached the city weeks ago, and the tension in every household was palpable. Katarzyna Nowak, a young nurse, moved through the wards of a small hospital, tending to the sick and injured with practiced precision. Her hands, though steady, betrayed the anxiety she tried to hide. News from the border was grim. The German army was large, disciplined, and relentless. Poland's military leaders assured the population that they would fight, but Katarzyna knew that war brought no promises, only loss. In London, Captain Edward Hartmann paced the floor of his office in Whitehall. Maps covered every wall, pins and strings crisscrossing to show German troop movements, naval positions, and possible invasion routes. Edward had spent months gathering intelligence, decoding intercepted messages, and briefing high-ranking officers. The tension in his office was suffocating, a tangible weight pressing down on his shoulders. He paused at the window, watching the gray skies over the Thames, imagining the chaos that would soon engulf Europe. Edward was a man trained to anticipate danger, yet even he could not fully comprehend the scale of what was about to happen. Then, on the morning of September 1st, it happened. The quiet of the early day shattered with the roar of German planes over Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, descended upon Warsaw, tearing through the city's defenses with shocking speed. Katarzyna's hospital was inundated with the wounded. She moved from one patient to another, treating shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and burns, her heart pounding with fear. Outside, buildings crumbled under relentless bombardment. The streets were littered with debris, overturned cars, and panicked civilians. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the acrid scent of fire clinging to everything. Katarzyna helped a young boy whose leg was trapped under rubble, her own hands trembling as she lifted the debris with the help of nearby civilians. Every second brought a new wave of horror. Meanwhile, in Germany, Klaus Weber's regiment was already deep into Polish territory. They moved with precision, following orders that demanded obedience without question. Yet, as they advanced through towns and villages, Klaus witnessed scenes that unsettled him. Homes burned, families fled, and people were dragged from their houses. He saw soldiers destroy food supplies and livestock, and he could not reconcile these actions with the ideals he had been taught. That night, as he lay on his bunk in a small village commandeered by the Wehrmacht, Klaus stared at the ceiling and asked himself a question he had never dared speak aloud. Is this truly the glory we were promised? Back in London, Edward's intelligence network reported the invasion almost immediately. Maps were redrawn, messages sent, and emergency meetings convened. Edward worked tirelessly, coordinating with spies in Germany and Poland, sending coded instructions to operatives in occupied territories. Every decision he made carried life and death consequences. He understood the stakes. The fate of millions rested on the ability of a few individuals to anticipate enemy moves and relay crucial information. Yet despite the pressure, he felt a strange clarity. This was his purpose. In the chaos, he could act, and action, no matter how small, was better than helplessness. As the first days of war unfolded, the lives of these three individuals, Katarzyna, Klaus, and Edward, began to move toward collision, though none of them knew it yet. Katarzyna's courage and skill would soon place her at the heart of a growing resistance effort. Klaus's moral conflict would draw him into decisions that could betray his country, or save countless lives. And Edward's intelligence work would determine the success or failure of early Allied operations. Each was alone, each was tested, and each was about to face choices that would define not only their lives, but the lives of thousands around them. On the fourth day of the invasion, as bombs continued to rain over Warsaw, Katarzyna paused for a moment in the ruined courtyard of the hospital. She saw a father holding his daughter close, their faces streaked with soot and tears, and she realized that war did not care for innocence. It consumed everything in its path: families, homes, ideals, and even the morality of men. She steeled herself and returned to her patients. There was no time to grieve, only to act. Klaus, on the other side of the front line, received orders to secure a village that had resisted German occupation. As he surveyed the town from a hilltop, he noticed the fear in the villagers' eyes. Mothers clutched children, fathers tried to hide weapons, and old men watched silently, knowing their time had passed. Klaus hesitated, a split-second decision that would haunt him: to follow orders blindly or to question them. The shadow of doubt had grown heavy, and he could no longer ignore it. In London, Edward compiled reports on German tactics, analyzing the speed and ferocity of the Blitzkrieg. He realized that Poland's fall could be swift and the human cost catastrophic. He sent urgent messages to commanders across Europe, emphasizing the need for immediate preparation. Yet, amid the calculations, he felt a pang of helplessness. Statistics and maps could not capture the screams, the fear, or the courage of ordinary people caught in the storm. And so, as the first week of September drew to a close, Europe was transformed. Cities burned, armies advanced, and millions of lives were thrown into uncertainty. The world had changed in the blink of an eye, and there was no turning back. In Berlin, Warsaw, and London, 3 individuals, 1 nurse, 1 soldier, 1 intelligence officer, stood at the threshold of history. Each faced a future that demanded bravery, resilience, and an unyielding will to act. The gathering storm had arrived, and only those willing to navigate its fury would survive. The morning of September 5th dawned gray and heavy over Warsaw. Smoke from burning buildings hung like a shroud over the city, twisting the sunlight into a dull, orange haze. The German Blitzkrieg had swept across the countryside with terrifying speed. Tanks rolled like thunder across the plains, while the Luftwaffe painted the skies with streaks of death. Every hour brought more destruction, more despair. Poland was on its knees. Katarzyna Nowak moved through the rubble-strewn streets, a satchel of medical supplies slung over her shoulder. The air was filled with the cries of children and the groans of the wounded. She ducked under a collapsed archway and helped a man trapped beneath wooden beams. His face was ashen, his leg mangled, but she worked quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos. Around her, volunteers and fellow nurses did what they could, but the scale of suffering was staggering. Each bomb, each explosion, seemed to undo any hope for safety. "I need more bandages," Katarzyna shouted to a young volunteer as another air raid siren wailed in the distance. Civilians scrambled for cover, but Katarzyna stayed with her patient. Every life she saved was a small victory, but the losses mounted faster than they could count. She paused only long enough to glance at the shattered buildings lining the street and whispered a silent prayer. "God, protect them. Protect us." Meanwhile, deep in the Polish countryside, Klaus Weber and his regiment advanced toward the town of Przasnysz. From the ridge above, he watched as smoke curled from the village below. Soldiers under his command moved efficiently, their boots sinking into mud churned by tanks. Orders were clear: secure the town, destroy any resistance. Yet Klaus's stomach churned as he observed the villagers fleeing their homes. Mothers carried children, old men hobbled with canes, and terrified families abandoned everything they owned. The Wehrmacht's efficiency left no room for hesitation, no room for morality. Klaus turned away from the scene, trying to shut the images from his mind. He had been trained to obey, to believe in victory, but the faces of the innocent haunted him. As his unit pushed forward, he realized with a sinking feeling that obedience came at a cost measured in blood. That night, lying in a commandeered barn with the sounds of distant gunfire echoing in the fields, Klaus began to question everything he had been taught. Was this conquest? Or merely cruelty disguised as duty? In London, Edward Hartmann pored over reports from his intelligence network. Polish radio transmissions intercepted German orders, and eyewitness accounts painted a grim picture. Poland was crumbling under the weight of mechanized warfare, and the human toll was staggering. Edward's pen flew across the margins of his notes as he drafted recommendations for the British government: urgent aid, evacuation plans, reconnaissance missions. He understood that Europe's fate depended on swift, decisive action, yet he also felt a bitter frustration. The machinery of war moved faster than diplomacy, faster than preparation. By mid-September, the first refugees began arriving in makeshift camps along the borders. Katarzyna escorted families to a converted school building, now serving as a temporary shelter. She worked tirelessly to provide food, medical care, and reassurance. The lines between civilian and soldier blurred as men, women, and children huddled together, sharing stories of loss and survival. The cries of children haunted her, and every night she lay awake, haunted by the faces of those she could not save. Yet, she refused to succumb to despair. Action, not grief, was her weapon against the darkness. Klaus, meanwhile, was ordered to participate in operations that would crush remaining resistance pockets. During a raid on a small village, he witnessed soldiers executing men who had attempted to hide or flee. The brutality was swift and merciless. Klaus's hands shook as he held his rifle, his heart heavy with guilt. He had been trained to kill, to obey, yet he could not reconcile this with the man he wanted to be. That night, under the cold glow of a moonlit sky, Klaus made a decision. He would no longer ignore the humanity around him. He would not be a mindless instrument of destruction. Back in Warsaw, Katarzyna found herself in the heart of the city's devastation. Hospitals overflowed, streets were impassable, and every moment brought new casualties. She treated soldiers and civilians alike, her uniform stained with blood, her face smeared with soot. She learned to make impossible decisions in seconds: which patients to save, which wounds could wait, which lives were already beyond hope. Each day, the war forced her to confront the fragility of life and the resilience of the human spirit. Edward's work in London grew ever more urgent. Reports of German movements, tactical advances, and civilian crises filled his office. He coordinated with intelligence officers across Europe, sending coded messages into occupied territories. Each decision was critical. Each instruction carried weight. Edward knew that the smallest miscalculation could cost thousands of lives. And yet, amid the tension, he found moments of clarity and purpose. In the storm of war, he could act. He could influence outcomes, even if only a little. As September ended, the human cost of the German invasion became undeniable. Entire towns lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and the landscape of Europe was scarred with fire and death. For Katarzyna, survival was an act of courage. For Klaus, questioning orders was an act of rebellion. For Edward, intelligence and strategy were acts of defiance against an unstoppable force. The war had revealed the depths of human cruelty, but it had also revealed the courage and resilience of those willing to resist it. And so, as the first month of conflict drew to a close, the world was irrevocably changed. 3 lives, separated by borders and allegiances, were moving inexorably toward one another. Each would be tested, each would face impossible choices, and each would leave a mark on history. The storm of war had arrived, and Europe was drenched in blood. Yet within that chaos, sparks of humanity, courage, and defiance endured, flickers of light in the encroaching darkness. By the spring of 1940, the war had spread across Europe like wildfire. France, Belgium, and the Low Countries were under the tightening grip of the German war machine, and the Allies scrambled to respond. In the shadows, a network of brave men and women worked tirelessly to resist the occupation. Among them were Katarzyna Nowak, now a seasoned nurse and courier, and Captain Edward Hartmann, coordinating intelligence operations from London, directing them toward the heart of the enemy. Katarzyna had moved to the outskirts of Paris, now under German occupation, after the fall of Poland. The city she once remembered as vibrant was now muted under curfews, patrols, and checkpoints. Every street corner could hide a soldier or a collaborator. Yet in basements, hidden rooms, and abandoned warehouses, resistance cells thrived. Katarzyna had become part of one such cell, moving supplies, aiding refugees, and relaying messages across borders. Her courage had grown, but so had the weight of responsibility. Every step could be a trap, every trust a betrayal. Edward's reports from London had begun guiding operations deep inside occupied Europe. Using coded radio transmissions, he coordinated with French, Polish, and Belgian operatives. His eyes, weary from sleepless nights, scanned maps littered with pins and string, connecting the scattered threads of resistance. The intelligence he gathered could save thousands, but it also placed those brave enough to act directly in mortal danger. Each transmission he sent was a gamble. Success could mean a victory for the Allies. Failure could mean death for those in the field. Meanwhile, Klaus Weber's inner conflict reached a breaking point. Stationed near northern France, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with the war and his role in it. He saw villagers tortured, hostages executed, and neighbors betrayed by those seeking favor with the occupiers. The rigid order he once revered now seemed hollow and monstrous. In secret, Klaus began assisting civilians and passing discreet warnings to the resistance, taking enormous personal risk. Every act of defiance carried the weight of potential execution, but he could no longer ignore the atrocities around him. The paths of these three individuals began to converge when Katarzyna's resistance cell received intelligence of a German supply convoy moving through the countryside. Edward, through his radio network, had intercepted the plans and urgently directed her team to intercept it. The convoy carried weapons, food, and crucial documents that could turn the tide for local resistance fighters. Katarzyna's mission was simple in description, but perilous in execution. Gather the materials, relay the intelligence, and disappear without a trace. As she moved under the cover of night, Katarzyna felt the familiar thrill of fear and resolve. Shadows stretched across the deserted streets, and the hum of distant vehicles reminded her that danger was everywhere. She navigated narrow alleys, slipping past German patrols, and finally reached the rendezvous point, a crumbling warehouse near the riverbank. There, she encountered Klaus for the first time. Klaus, tasked with escorting part of the convoy through occupied territory, was surprised by the small, determined group waiting for him. He had expected armed soldiers or cautious villagers, but instead found Katarzyna and her team ready for action. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and unspoken understanding passed between them. Both recognized the peril, and both recognized courage. With silent coordination, they executed the plan: intercept the convoy, secure the supplies, and vanish before German forces could respond. The operation was nearly flawless. Supplies were hidden in secret caches, critical documents copied, and the convoy diverted without casualties. Yet, as the group celebrated in whispered relief, an unmistakable feeling of unease settled over Katarzyna. One of the new recruits, a young man she had trusted, had been behaving oddly, lingering too long near German checkpoints and asking unnecessary questions. Suspicion gnawed at her. In the world of resistance, trust was a fragile, precious thing. Betrayal could destroy lives in an instant. Days later, her fears were confirmed. During a routine raid by German patrols, one of their safe houses was exposed. Several resistance members were arrested, including the young recruit. Katarzyna barely escaped, slipping through shadows with her life intact but burdened by the weight of guilt. The betrayal reminded her that war demanded more than courage. It demanded vigilance, cunning, and sometimes ruthless choices. Edward received the news of the compromised safe house in London. Frustration etched across his face. He had relied on that cell to relay crucial intelligence, and now the operation had been compromised. Yet, he refused to dwell on failure. There was work to be done, more lives to save, more missions to coordinate. In war, hesitation could be as deadly as betrayal. He immediately began reorganizing networks, redirecting messages, and securing alternative routes. His mind was a battlefield as intense as any frontline clash, each decision a knife edge between life and death. Klaus, too, felt the sting of betrayal. He had provided subtle aid to resistance members, trusting their intentions. But the young man who had been captured was a double agent, feeding information to the Germans in exchange for leniency. Klaus's hand trembled as he realized how close he had come to exposure. He understood now the stakes were higher than he had imagined. His every move was a gamble, one that could cost him his life or countless others. Despite setbacks, the trio's determination hardened. Katarzyna continued her work, more careful, more strategic. She learned to spot lies, to anticipate danger, and to trust only the evidence of her own eyes. Edward coordinated operations with renewed intensity, analyzing risks and planning contingencies. Klaus, quietly defiant, continued to act in secret, slipping aid to the resistance, sabotaging German operations, and cultivating allies within his own ranks. Their courage became a beacon, small and flickering, in the darkness of occupied Europe. As 1941 approached, the world seemed to spin further into chaos. Cities burned, families were torn apart, and alliances shifted like quicksand. Yet even in betrayal, fear, and relentless danger, sparks of hope endured. Resistance fighters, civilians, and those brave enough to question orders demonstrated the resilience of humanity. Katarzyna, Edward, and Klaus, each from different worlds, each bound by duty, morality, and courage, were now connected by the invisible threads of war. Their journeys would collide, bringing them face to face with impossible choices, deep bonds, and the harsh realities of survival. The war was no longer a distant threat or abstract concept. It was a living, breathing force that demanded loyalty, courage, and vigilance. Every act of resistance, every calculated risk, and every small victory mattered. The stakes had never been higher, and the shadows of betrayal loomed larger than ever. Europe was a continent in turmoil, and amidst the chaos, three individuals were learning the hardest lesson of all. In war, trust was precious, courage was essential, and every choice carried consequences that would echo far beyond the battlefield. By the summer of 1943, the war had shifted. The Allies were beginning to regain ground. In North Africa, victories at El Alamein and in Tunisia had slowed the Axis advance. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces pushed back, and whispers of hope stirred among the oppressed in occupied Europe. Yet, the cost of war had grown unbearable. Cities lay in ruins, millions had perished, and the shadow of death lingered over every battlefield. Katarzyna Nowak, now a seasoned member of the French resistance, had witnessed the horrors of occupation firsthand. She had lost friends, colleagues, and entire communities. But her resolve had not wavered. She had become a symbol of hope for those who remained, guiding refugees through secret routes, providing medical care, and delivering intelligence crucial to the Allies. Her courage was tested daily. Every mission carried the risk of capture or death, and betrayal lurked around every corner. Yet she pressed on, knowing that inaction meant certain death for countless innocents. Edward Hartmann's work in London had grown even more critical. With intelligence flowing from resistance networks across Europe, he coordinated operations to disrupt German supply lines and prepare for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. Each message he sent carried crucial instructions. Sabotage this bridge, relay this troop movement, hide these refugees. Every success meant lives saved. Every failure meant slaughter. Edward worked tirelessly, knowing that the coming months would decide the fate of millions. In his quiet moments, he reflected on the human cost, aware that no map, no report could capture the fear, courage, and sacrifice he witnessed through his network. Klaus Weber, still stationed in northern France, had become a clandestine ally of the resistance. His acts of quiet defiance grew bolder. He sabotaged German convoys, misdirected patrols, and smuggled food and medical supplies to those in need. The risk was enormous. Discovery would mean certain execution, But Klaus could no longer remain a passive participant in atrocities. His conscience demanded action, and in doing so, he found a sense of purpose that had long eluded him in the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. The turning point came with the planning of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Edward worked around the clock, coordinating intelligence with French resistance fighters, gathering reports on German fortifications, troop strength, and supply routes. The stakes could not have been higher. Every detail mattered. The tides, the weather, the placement of mines, the movement of soldiers. Edward knew that failure was not an option. Thousands of lives, and the fate of Europe, depended on meticulous planning, courage, and trust in those willing to risk everything behind enemy lines. Katarzyna received instructions to guide a group of refugees and resistance fighters to a coastal safe house near the Normandy beaches. The mission was simple in description but deadly in practice. German patrols were frequent, checkpoints unforgiving, and betrayal always a possibility. She moved with a quiet determination, keeping her group hidden, her eyes scanning constantly for danger. Along the way, she encountered Klaus, who had been assigned to observe German movements along the same route. Their reunion was tense, but unspoken understanding passed between them. Both had risked everything to defy orders and save lives. Together, they navigated through forests, abandoned villages, and bombed-out towns. Each step brought them closer to the coast, and closer to imminent danger. German patrols were relentless, and the threat of discovery was ever present. At one point, Klaus held a pistol to silence a soldier's shout, his hands steady despite the chaos. Katarzyna, tending to a wounded child, marveled at his calm determination. In that moment, they recognized that courage was not just bravery, it was discipline, intelligence, and the willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. On the night before D-Day, Edward's voice crackled through the radio, giving final instructions to resistance cells along the coast. Bridges were to be destroyed, German communication lines cut, and intelligence relayed to Allied command. The tension in his voice mirrored the stakes of the mission. One misstep could unravel months of planning and cost thousands of lives. Yet Edward remained resolute. The war demanded action, and hesitation was not an option. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted in chaos. Allied forces stormed the shore under relentless gunfire, artillery, and aerial bombardment. Bombs shook the earth, waves crashed against the sand, and soldiers charged forward with grim determination. Behind the front lines, resistance fighters, guided by Katarzyna and Klaus, sabotaged German reinforcements, creating confusion and opening paths for advancing Allied troops. Every small act contributed to the larger mission, a tapestry of courage and defiance woven across the chaos of battle. Katarzyna, working feverishly to treat the wounded, felt the full weight of war. Blood, smoke, and screams filled the air, yet she pressed on, offering comfort and care wherever possible. Klaus, moving covertly among German lines, sabotaged vehicles, and relayed critical information to resistance cells, risking death with every step. Edward, in London, monitored the unfolding invasion, his heart pounding with every report, knowing that months of planning were either succeeding or failing in real time. By nightfall, the tide had begun to turn. The Allies had secured beachheads, the German defense was fractured, and hope began to bloom amidst the carnage. Yet victory came at an unimaginable cost. Thousands lay dead or wounded, entire towns had been destroyed, and Europe remained a continent in turmoil. For Katarzyna, Klaus, and Edward, the mission was far from over. There were more lives to save, more civilians to protect, and more battles to fight. In the aftermath, as resistance fighters regrouped and the wounded were tended, the three individuals took a rare moment to breathe. The war was still raging, but they had struck a decisive blow against oppression. Their courage, determination, and collaboration had made a difference, however small, in the vast machinery of conflict. They understood that the struggle was far from over, but for the first time, there was a tangible sense that the tide was beginning to turn. Europe remained scarred, but hope flickered amid the ruins. The human spirit, tested by brutality and despair, had not been extinguished. Katarzyna, Klaus, and Edward, each from different worlds, bound by fate and the war's cruel demands, had played a part in this turning point. They had faced fear, betrayal, and death, and yet had emerged, weary but unbroken, ready to continue the fight. The war was far from over, but the shadow of defeat for the Allies was receding. The turning tide had arrived, and with it, the promise that courage, resilience, and determination could challenge even the darkest forces in history. May 1945. Europe was silent. The roar of artillery, the shriek of air raids, the cries of despair, all had faded. The Third Reich had fallen, and cities once engulfed in fire and smoke lay in ruins. Across the continent, survivors emerged from hiding, from prisons, from bombed-out homes, and from refugee camps. For some, the war had taken everything. For others, it had left scars invisible, but equally deep. Katarzyna Nowak stood in the remains of a Parisian hospital, now converted into a temporary shelter. The building bore the marks of German occupation, shattered windows, scorch marks along the walls, and faded propaganda posters clinging stubbornly to the plaster. She moved quietly among the survivors, women, children, and the elderly, providing what care she could. Her hands, though calloused and tired, still moved with precision. She had lost colleagues, friends, and patients, but she had endured. The war had forged her courage, tempered her resolve, and revealed the depth of her compassion. Edward Hartmann arrived in Paris days later, overseeing the transition from wartime intelligence operations to relief and reconstruction. His face, lined with the fatigue of years spent in offices, war rooms, and behind radios, reflected both relief and solemnity. The intelligence networks he had coordinated had helped the Allies gain strategic advantage, but he knew the cost had been immense. Reports of casualties, missing persons, and destroyed infrastructure weighed heavily on his conscience. Yet amidst the sorrow, there was hope. Towns could be rebuilt, families reunited, and Europe could begin again. Klaus Weber, now a man marked by both guilt and redemption, had risked everything to aid the resistance. In the final months of the war, his covert acts of defiance had saved countless lives, yet he carried the memory of those he could not save. Stationed temporarily in liberated towns, Klaus moved among civilians, helping rebuild infrastructure and deliver supplies. He remained cautious, aware that even in victory, the ghosts of the past lingered. Every ruined house, every scarred street, reminded him of the cost of obedience unchecked by morality. The three of them, Katarzyna, Edward, and Klaus, would meet for the first time in the liberated village of Bayeux, Normandy. It was a quiet morning, the sun glinting on shattered rooftops, as they approached a makeshift memorial erected to honor fallen civilians and resistance fighters. There was an unspoken recognition in their eyes. Each had fought, each had survived, and each bore witness to the horrors of the war. Katarzyna approached first, her gaze meeting Edward's and then Klaus's. For a moment, the enormity of the conflict seemed to fade, replaced by the simple acknowledgement of shared struggle and endurance. They walked among the memorials together, observing the names of the fallen etched into stone. Katarzyna traced the letters of a young boy who had perished during the occupation. Edward noted the name of a resistance fighter whose intelligence had saved hundreds of lives. Klaus lingered at a marker for villagers executed during a German reprisal. Each reflection brought a mixture of grief and relief. They had survived, but the cost was etched into every memory. The post-war months were filled with challenges. Cities needed rebuilding, families needed reunification, and the psychological wounds of trauma needed attention. Katarzyna helped establish temporary medical centers for survivors, training young nurses to continue the work. Edward coordinated the transition of intelligence networks into reconstruction efforts, ensuring that information about displaced persons, missing civilians, and war crimes was accurately documented. Klaus, though mistrusted by some, worked quietly with local authorities and former resistance fighters to repair infrastructure and provide aid to those in need. Yet, peace was not simple. The war had left Europe fractured, politically, socially, and emotionally. Former allies and enemies now had to navigate a delicate balance between accountability, justice, and rebuilding. For Klaus, the transition was particularly difficult. Once a soldier in the Wehrmacht, he faced suspicion and resentment, despite his covert actions aiding the resistance. Katarzyna and Edward, having witnessed his courage and integrity firsthand, became advocates for him, reminding others that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Months passed, and slowly life returned. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and streets began to bustle with cautious optimism. Katarzyna watched children play where rubble had once lain, a small smile touching her lips despite the memories she carried. Edward returned to London occasionally, overseeing the coordination of humanitarian efforts and documenting the history of operations that had aided the Allies. Klaus, quietly integrated into the local community, helped rebuild homes, teach, and guide those who had survived. In one rare moment of respite, the three of them sat on a hill overlooking Bayeux, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by distant laughter and the rustle of leaves. They shared stories of survival, acts of bravery, and memories of loss. Though the war was over, its shadow lingered in their hearts. Yet there was also a sense of hope, proof that even amidst devastation, courage and humanity could prevail. Katarzyna spoke softly. "We survived, but so many didn't. We must remember them." Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And we must ensure that the stories of courage, sacrifice, and resistance are never forgotten. History is more than strategy, it is people." Klaus remained silent for a long moment, then said, "I have learned that obeying orders without conscience destroys the soul. We must rebuild not just the cities, but our humanity." Together, they rose, their silhouettes framed against the fading light. The war had ended, but its lessons remained. Courage in the face of impossible odds, the necessity of moral choice, and the resilience of the human spirit. They had been forged in the fires of conflict, tested by loss and betrayal, and emerged with a shared understanding of what it meant to endure. As they walked back toward the village, they carried with them both sorrow and hope. The shadows of war would linger, but the promise of peace, painful, fragile, yet undeniable, stretched before them. Europe would rebuild, families would reunite, and history would remember the courage of those who refused to surrender their humanity. The war had ended, but the story of survival, courage, and resilience would echo for generations. Katarzyna, Edward, and Klaus, once strangers bound by circumstance, had found not only survival but purpose, a testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit.